Will Storr, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
It's a pleasure. As I was saying to you before we started rolling here, that I want to talk about your new book on narrative and how we evolved for stories and how we can harness that, in our business life and elsewhere. And you also have written in a very compelling way about the issue of status. And there's going to be some overlap in these two conversations, but we'll start with narrative and then move to status. Is that you copacetic?
Yeah, perfect. That sounds
awesome.
Great.
So in your new book, you make this case that storytelling is like hardwired into us as a species. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so our brains are literally, we're storytellers. Humans are the only animal that experiences their lives as story in like narrative form. So beginning, middle, and end. We fantasize about happy endings in the future. We ruminate about things we've done in the past. We experience other people as heroes, villains, allies, Judases. So we're constantly living in this story world, and we're constantly at the center of this kind of unfolding narrative.
Why was that important from an evolutionary standpoint?
Well, story does something quite magical, really. What story allows us to do is kind of fuse individual brains together so everybody's thinking in the same way. And that, I argue, is the original purpose of story. So, humans are an ape. We're not like an ape. We are an ape. But unlike all the other apes, we rely on each other to survive. So other apes live in troops, but they hunt individually and they behave individually. Whereas we absolutely rely on each other to survive. So we're kind of like an ape, but we're kind of like an ant as well. We're kind of this weird hybrid species. So how do you do that? How do you achieve that if you're in, Captain Evolution? Yeah, you invent story, and what story does is it takes over an individual brain, takes over lots of individual brains and wires them together so everybody understands the world in the same way. Everybody's focused towards the same ultimate goal. Everybody has the same values. So that's what story's doing. It's fusing human brains together into one.
This is maybe a digression, but did you ever read The Overstory?
No.
Richard Powers is a brilliant novelist. He wrote this book called The Overstory. It won a Pulitzer Prize. The Overstory it shouldn't have worked because it's a book about trees. But actually it's about our relationship to trees and in a larger sense, our relationship to nature. But there's a moment in the Overstory where Powers is describing one of his characters, and hopefully I'm not mangling this, but one of the characters is a kid and he's studying ants. And looking at how they move in synchrony and then thinking about how the humans are, fucked because we really can't do that in some way. And he has this image of like an out of order sign hung on off the phallus of a human, like that we just can't, this is why we can't get it together on climate or anything else. But as I listen to you, I'm thinking, actually, if we could all tell ourselves the right story about our future, well, we actually could collaborate on these seemingly intractable but also existential issues facing the species, like climate, like AI, like nukes. Like I said, that was a digression, but I say it to see if you have any reaction.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But I think the important thing is telling the right kind of story, and there are right and wrong ways of telling stories that motivate people and persuade people. And often, especially on the left, for some reason, the left are just not quite as good as telling stories, in my kind of experience, as the right. The right seems to have sort of an instinct for this. That the left tend to go to data and facts a lot more, and that stuff kind of fails to inspire. The left also sometimes falls into the trap of telling an overly kind of negative story. So, for example, I mean, one of the things is that I've sort of experienced myself over the last few years, over the rise of identity politics that's sort of taken over the UK and America, is that, of course, people with a deep interest in identity politics are very interested in making everybody more anti-racist and making that a kind of a dominant sort of motivation in their daily lives. And how a lot of people involved in identity politics do that is by telling a very negative story about how awful we are and how terrible things are for people. And, I'm not saying that any of that isn't true. It's all true. It's a true story, but it's not a story that motivates. And the story that you never hear in the UK, for example, is that, well, the UK have an incredible history of anti-racism. We were the first people in the world to outlaw slavery. We spent 70 years in the high seas, spending fortunes sacrificing blood to police the high seas, to abolish the slave ships. We were pivotal in fighting the fascists of the Second World War. So we have anti-racism in our blood, in our culture. And, that's the story that would motivate people in Britain to become more interested in fighting racism. But you never hear that story. You just don't ever hear it. They never tell it. And in fact, there was a campaign to erect a statue in one of the coastal towns in memory of the young men that died fighting slavery, and they were refused permission to to erect this statue. For me, it's this failure of understanding story. People want to be told a positive, optimistic story, a story that makes them feel, gives them status, and so the story I was describing is one that says that kind of implants this idea of anti-racism in British culture. And says, well, stories are never fully true. Stories are always, of course, the reality is way more complex than that, especially in Britain with our colonial history. But if you want to motivate people, if you want to make people fold anti-racism into their identity and to make it a core part of who they are, you've got to tell them a positive story and saying this is already who you are, and value it, make it, treasure it, make that a source of status. The fact that we fought the slavers, the fact that we fought in the Second World War, and we helped destroy Hitler, the world's biggest ever, most monstrous ever fascist. So it's people still don't really understand how to deploy storytelling in the right way. That you have to tell a positive story, a story that my book is called "A Story Is a Deal." A story has to make a deal with you, and that the deal often is for status. And so if you accept my story, the reward for you is connection or status usually.
So we've already gotten the status, or as you would say, status.
Sorry.
You're probably saying it correctly. So we've already gotten there. So, but what do you mean by status or status in this context? And what do you mean?
When you talk about status, people often jump to things like, the Kardashians and celebrity culture and, billionaires and the idea that people, the pursuit of status is the pursuit of celebrity and fortunes. Then it isn't that. The status is simply the sense that you are of value somehow to other people. Humans have two great psychological desires that really control so much of our experience, our everyday life. One of those is belongingness. We want to feel loved and belonging. So with friends, with lovers, with family, of course, we want to feel accepted, and we are accepted and acceptable. But as well as that, we want to feel of value. We want to feel like we're offering something back to other people. So we want to be respected, and that's the status part of it. So that's another great drive. You can think of it when people, universally, when people feel rejected, they feel terrible. A human being, it's the opposite of connection. And the same way, if people feel disrespected, they're made to feel worthless and valueless. Then that's also a universally negative experience for human beings. And so that kind of speaks to our constant desire and a constant interest in those two things of connection and status.
It strikes me that these fundamental human drives for connection, for status, for and frankly, for storytelling, can all be harnessed or deployed for good and very dangerously for ill.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true. You can see it, in the history that's unfolding around us at the moment, and the history that we look back on is that story is incredibly seductive. Story is how we understand the world. Story is how we think. Story is how we understand who we are and what we should be doing and where we should be going. So if somebody comes along and tells a really really compelling story, and a story that offers us status and offers us connection, we'll always be vulnerable to believing it. The brain's far more interested in the story that we're telling about ourselves than it is in understanding the truth. We're not wired for truth. We're wired for story.
Well, we will come back to status in a much deeper way in the in the later portions of this conversation. Like, given that it is a huge part of our makeup, how do we live with this drive? How do we manage our desire for status without driving ourselves crazy? And you have a lot of interesting thoughts about that. But let's stay with storytelling, because as you said earlier, in a business context and in many other contexts, if you do it the right way, you can have really powerful impacts by telling a story. And so I'd be curious to get tactical, what are the elements of a properly deployed story? And one of the practical tips, and you can tell me if this is the wrong place to start. But one of the practical tips in your book is to identify what is the primary motivator of the audience you are speaking to.
It's really all about understanding your audience and understanding the story that they tell about themselves and that they tell about the world. What are the things that they value? One thing that all storytellers are always trying to do, whether they're writing a Hollywood movie script or a novel, or whether they're crafting a advertising campaign, is this feeling of identification. So that feeling that when the audience is experiencing your story, they identify with it. They think, well, yeah, I understand that. I understand that person that I'm seeing. And then once they've identified with your character, with your story, they're kind of in, they've connected to it. And so that's the first, really important thing. Once you've identified with the story, with a character in a story, with a message in a story, you experience that feeling of connection, which is one of the gifts of storytelling. And then, of course, the other thing is status. You can tell a story about how people like us in this story can make ourselves feel more valued and more valuable, and that's also extremely seductive.
In terms of the connection piece, one of the concepts you talk about is the importance of having a protagonist who is, and you use this term, a relatable underdog.
Underdog is such a for me, a fascinating kind of concept, because, of course, there's huge psychological diversity as you go around the world. Everybody's very different in lots and lots of ways. But if there's one thing that people kind of share, unless you're suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, perhaps, is the sense that you're an underdog. The sense that you've got these great goals, you've got these meaningful things that you want to achieve, but it's hard and you're struggling, and you're the underdog. And it's interesting when you sort of hear kind of billionaires and politicians speak. Even the most powerful people in the world tend to feel like underdogs, and in terms of their kind of personal experience, they often are facing incredible threats, incredible challenges. I mean, life is struggle against obstacles. That's a description of not just human life, but all life. So there's a sense in which we are all always feeling like an underdog. And I think that's why underdogs are so relatable. Showing an underdog in a story is a really great shortcut to identification. When we see an underdog, when we see somebody struggling against odds, we automatically feel a kinship with that character. It's very seductive. I mean, the book I write about, I think it was Disney, they were designing this skating rabbit robot for Disney parks, and they had a problem that the skating rabbit robot felt inhuman somehow. And so what they did was they programmed it to struggle a bit on its skates. It fell over on its skates, and it got up and managed to skate. And by adding this moment of vulnerability, this kind of underdog moment of struggling against an obstacle, suddenly people loved the skating rabbit. So it became, they identified with it. It became relatable.
I'm many years into writing my next book, which is a memoir. And so I'm thinking I'm going to steal some of these ideas.
Do it.
For people listening at home who want to steal some of these ideas and apply it to their lives, specifically as it relates to the relatable underdog, if you're pitching a business, or if you're trying to rally the troops in an existing business or in your family, or in whatever context you're in, to tell the story either of, hey, get on my side, see things the way I see it, because I'm going to tell you about me and my struggles, or make it a collective, hey, we are the underdog. Here are the struggles we're facing against. Let's do it together. Am I articulating this correctly?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, as I say, the great challenge of all storytellers is creating that sense of identification with the character in the story, or even the brand that you're trying to promote. And telling a story in which you present as an underdog is automatically relatable. People just tend to prefer, they feel connected to underdogs because that's their experience of life. So yeah, that's absolutely correct.
The other thing you talk about in terms of telling a story in a powerful way is the importance of emotion. Can you say more about that?
So we've been emotional creatures for far longer than we have been storytelling creatures. We've had emotions and feeling systems for millions of years, since before we were human. So we still really are guided by our emotions. We are feeling creatures that think. I think Antonio Damasio, the Italian neuroscientist, said that. So story works really by manipulating emotions or making you feel something. So story is this kind of interface that sits on top of our emotions, and you can experience that most obviously at a cinema, or a theatre, where everybody goes into the cinema in the midst of their own lived experience of story, their own life. And if it's a good film, if it's identifiable and they get sucked into it, then their experience of their own story shuts off. They experience the story that they're being shown on the screen all at once. Their brains fuse together. And importantly, they feel those feelings. They feel elated when the protagonist has a win. They feel terrified when the protagonist is in danger. If the story has a happy ending and everything comes nice at the end, they feel wonderful and fantastic, and they leave the cinema all feeling connected and all feeling sort of, buzzing with happiness together. So that's another way that stories are fusing brains together. They're making people feel the same things, and that's really the core of the power of story is that it does manipulate and sort of alter people's emotions.
You cite some data that if the story has emotion, it can lead to better recall and stronger influence.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think there was a BBC study that they did with some neuroscientists that looked at the effectiveness of advertising campaigns. It was a cross-cultural study too, so it was people in the West, people in Asia, and I think people in South America, if I remember correctly. And they found that the advertisements that were best recalled were the ones that were most emotional. So regular emotional peaks in the story that they were telling implanted the message of the advert in their mind successfully, and it didn't really matter what the emotion was the surprising result. It was just, as long as it was emotional, they would remember it. So that's why you get a lot of adverts that they just seem to be there to make you laugh, make you smile, make you feel a bit weepy. They're just doing that thing of making you feel an emotion and then putting their logo on that emotion, and then. Because a lot of what marketing is, mostly what marketing is a war for memory. When you're in the convenience, when you 7-Eleven and you're in front of the wall of fridges deciding what drink to get on a hot summer's day, they want their drink to be the first drink that pops into your mind. So they're all fighting this war for memory, and that's why a lot of advertising is just simply the repetition of logos. That's why they fight for shelf space at eye level, because they want to, by brutal repetition, just get that logo into your head. And a really effective way of doing that is by telling emotional stories in the form of advertising, because it, using that emotion, it implants that logo, that kind of brand identity into your mind.
Let's talk about some more practical storytelling techniques for business and elsewhere.
I think there are a few sort of basic principles. One of the most important principles, especially for marketeers, is simplicity. Absolute simplicity is really crucial that when you're trying to tell persuasive stories, and that's important whether you're making an advert or whether you're leading a team. One of the stories that I tell in a story as a deal is NASA. Like before, JFK came up with the idea of NASA's one goal to be to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade, I think something like that. They had 6 or 7 various goals, and then that became their one goal. And there's an academic did a really amazing study looking at the internal culture of NASA and found it became transformed when they had that one simple goal that you could visualize. You could imagine a man walking on the moon. So the ability to visualize is also very important. That everybody, including the person cleaning the toilets, the secretaries at the front desk, all became highly motivated because they were all felt part of this story that we've got this collective mission. We're going to put a man on the moon. So that absolute simplicity, that sense that you can visualize the end goal. Bill Gates famously, his early ambition was to have a computer on the desk of every office. That's a visual. That's a goal that you can visualize. So that's a really great story that can rally the troops, that can motivate people. Very simple. It's one thing, and you can visualize it. So that's what's really essential for leaders, I think, to have that commitment to absolute simplicity in the stories that they tell. And again, they're all optimistic. They're all positive. They're not beating people around the head with bad news, saying you must do better. It's a vision of an incredible future that is simple and easy to see.
I just started a company a couple of months ago, so I'm really taking notes about
cool.
Let's just go back to this issue of status. We talked about what it is. Actually, as we go back to it, remind me again what it is. In a few words, what is status?
So status is just this feeling that you are of value to other people, that you're offering value to the human group, to the collective.
Thank you for the refresher. And one of the things you talk about is that we have this kind of status detection system. What does that mean?
Psychologists, neuroscientists talk about this idea that we have this status detection system, this always-on bit of technology that's constantly assessing where our relative status is in any social situation that we might being. So it's constantly looking for how people are treating us in a million different ways, how close they're standing to us, the amount of eye contact they're giving us, how much they're letting us speak. That's a big one. All the ways that we can measure status. It never ends. In one study, they gave lots of people glasses of orange juice, and one person got less orange juice than everybody else. And of course, that person got very upset and started ruminating, why have I not got this orange juice? So the orange juice becomes a measure of relative status. So that's the status detection system. You can go into an elevator in a hotel and you're immediately looking at who's got the posh luggage, who's going to the suites on the top floor, who's the janitor. You can't go anywhere as a human being without your brain automatically judging where you sit and where everybody else sits. And that's the beginning of every hierarchy, every caste system, every class system. It all comes from this stuff in our brains. It's why you can never eradicate it. It's why communism was such a hopeless project, because you can't scrape this stuff from the human brain, because it's been in the brain since before we were human.
Well, there's the macro question of, how do we deal with this from a societal level? We can get to that if you want, but for me, I'm much more interested in this show, like in helping individuals do their lives better. And so as I listen to you talk about this always on technology, this status detection system, which of course I, like everybody else, relate to, it does seem like an organ in our brain or in our body whose job solely is to secrete suffering.
Well, yes, it's not. That's not. That's what you think, isn't it? And I think we are very attuned to the suffering that inevitably brings, but it also brings moments of great pleasure. I think status is just as good as it is bad, like equally. Like some of our most important moments in life are when we achieve something, when we get a great exam result, when we get the job that we wanted, when we publish the book, or you've just launched a business, when the business becomes successful. Like, let's not shit on these moments. I think they're really important. And I had an experience over Christmas where a very close friend of mine who's a writer was going through a hard time, and he'd read the book and liked it, and he was talking about about how he was sort of concerned about how his writing was going, and he said, it's just stupid, it's just ego. And I had to say to him, there is no just ego. I think that's part of the problem that we have in our culture, is that we're very influenced by these Eastern ideas that the ego is bad, and maybe it comes from Freud as well. I don't know. The ego is bad, that we should resist ego, but I think that's very, very dangerous. That's very damaging when we disregard the importance of status to people. I mean, as you no doubt know, down in the UK, in USA and elsewhere, the people who are most highly at risk from suicide are middle-aged men. And a lot of that is because middle-aged men, a lot of their status come from their roles in life, from their job, from, am I a provider and a protector to my family? How do I look? Am I, and in middle age, we hit our limits. Perhaps our marriage isn't as good as it used to be. Perhaps we stop being promoted. This stuff causes real pain. It really matters, and I think it's a real problem when we say, "Oh, it's just ego. It shouldn't really matter. It's it's just silly." It isn't silly. Status is a fundamental human need, and it matters. And so I think we should be much more compassionate to ourselves and to other people when they start feeling that inevitable suffering that comes along, when they feel for whatever reason that their status is under threat or is in decline.
I definitely. I will never argue against compassion. And is there not a kernel of wisdom in the "it's just ego"? Like, what is really important for that writer who's struggling? Is it having a bestseller and getting the accolades, or is it creating something beautiful that is helpful no matter how it's received?
Yeah, exactly. So there are lots of different ways that you can measure your status, and I'm not going to mention his name, but he really doesn't need any more status. He's very successful. But like, yeah. So there's lots of different ways you can measure status, and perhaps your latest thing isn't as successful as you might want it to be, but you're still moving people, you're still giving people great pleasure. And I think for me, the kernel of truth. So there's lots of different ways you can choose, you can measure your status. You don't have to be fixated on the one metric that you're not doing so well in. I think that's a great piece of advice. The other thing is, I do think there's wisdom in trying to reduce the ego pain. Like I'm not saying that there isn't wisdom in that, because of course there is. So I do think that matters, and if mindfulness helps you do that, then you go for it. But as I say, I think the danger is in that we have this very powerful cultural idea that the status shouldn't matter, and it's just ego. And when we feel bad when we fail, it's it is in itself a failure, and that's just not true. That's just not true.
So maybe a better phrase, and this is clunkier than it's just ego, is, you know what, I'm concerned about the status implications of whatever I'm worrying about, but perhaps I'm looking for status in the wrong place.
Yeah, exactly. Or measuring my status in the wrong way. I mean, one of the things that happens quite naturally to people as they get into later middle aged is that we tend to shift from pursuing our own status to becoming in more of a teacher role, like a sort of that was sort of like an intellectual grandparent role. And so I do suspect that that's a kind of natural way, like, that we do change the way that we're playing status games as we get older. We get value by teaching the next generation how to do what we've spent our lives learning how to do. So that's one way of doing it. I mean, another thing that I talk about in the status game are these different kinds of games there are to play. So there are three ways that humans essentially compete for status. I mean, there's lots, but there are three main ones. The first one is dominance, which is not good. I mean, that's the animalistic, pushing each other around. I'm going to force you to attend to me with status type of way, like a mafia don or an army, or a playground bully, indeed. We'll use to compete for status. And the other two are virtue. So in the human groups in which we evolved, you could earn status by being virtuous. So by knowing the rules, following the rules, being generous, being courageous. And then there are these competence games, success games, you being good at something. That's the other way that you offer value to other people, by creating value, economically, by becoming somebody that other people can copy and mimic, and by themselves, learn how to do something. And one of the things that I realized when I was writing the book was that, I think when you become a parent, you automatically start playing these virtue games, because you're doing good things for your children, hopefully, and then you start earning status through your children's success. But I'm not a parent, so all I really do is I get up and I work, So I'm got the kind of this monomaniacal obsession with this one competence-based status game, and I realize that's a very dangerous psychological place to be. You've got one thing, you've got one source of status. That's madness. So I started volunteering in my spare time, which is something I never would have thought about had I not done this book. And so now I spend about 4 hours a week, volunteering for a voluntary organization locally, and that's now an enormous source of significant source of status for me, because it's this virtue game that I'm playing that I wasn't playing before. So I think the other piece of advice is to play different kinds of games, or even play multiple competence-based status games. Like if you have a job at work and you enjoy your sports, you go and play football or soccer or whatever it is. That's another status game you're playing. So I think having multiple sources of status, especially as you start getting older, I think is really good advice.
And by game, you're not trying to minimize virtue. It's just a heuristic or rubric you're using to help us think about the many avenues available to us.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of defining a game as it's a collective of people who have an agreed set of rules. And if you follow the rules, you rise in status. So in that way, Christianity is a status game. You can be a good Christian or a bad. You accept the rules of Christianity, and you can. The harder you work at being a Christian, the higher you raise in status in the eyes of your fellow Christians. So I don't mean to use the word game to diminish anything at all. It's but it's that basic. I think the games that we play for fun, they're just riding on that neural circuitry that's evolved to play the actual games of life, the games that matter much more.
I think there might be more to say, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, about altruism as a really healthy source of status. And then also maybe some where that could get catastrophic. You want to pick up on that?
Yeah. So this is another thing that sort of surprised me as I was doing my research. It really made me see the world in a different way, because I think you would assume that if you want to change the world and be good, then you would play a virtue game. And if you wanted to just be rich and famous, you play a success game. But I became much more worried about virtue games as I was doing this research, partly because virtue is always local. So each collective has its own idea of what's virtuous, which is why you get such, we just go through this cultural period in the West, but much more seriously before that, we had Nazism and we had communism, both two terribly ideologies that were incredibly damaging and horrendous for different reasons. But both the Nazis and the communists, the committed ones, the ones who believed the story, were absolutely convinced that they were the virtuous ones, that the fight against the Bolsheviks, the fight against the Jews, was virtuous, that they were saving the world, that were making the world a better place. So virtue can be extremely dangerous because it's local. The brain doesn't care about, as I said, the truth; it just cares about the story. And so we can easily be seduced into doing terrible things as a way of building virtue-based status or harvesting virtue-based status from the people around us. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing was really this idea of changing the world and making the world a better place. And you realize that the people that have really changed the world, especially in the last 200 or 300 years, are the success game people, the people who pioneered the Industrial Revolution, the people who invented vaccines. I mean, I feel like the person who invented the polio vaccine has probably done more good for the world than all the popes combined. The Pope being a kind of virtue-based superstar. That also changed my mind. This idea that actually, if you genuinely want to change the world, then you should play success games, because it's the people who invent the things that are going to hopefully, at some point, we pray, rescue us from the climate crisis. These are the people, or the people who are inventing the vaccines, the people who are working out how to make healthy food cheap and deliver it to the doors of people who need it when they need it. These are the people that are doing incalculable good for the rest of the world. That's what I believe.
All right, you said a lot of things in there that I want to follow up on because they're so interesting. I'll come back to the benefits of altruism as a source of status. But just picking up on the last thing you said there about how playing success games in some way can be like the highest form of virtue in a way. Like you can create a lot of impact in that way. And it just got me thinking about something that I've gnawed on for a long time in my life, which is this balance between self-interest and altruism, and how that line is very blurry. And in many ways, there are aspects of altruism that are deeply self-interested because you feel good when you're useful to other people, and pursuing what could be derided as selfish success, business success, can have emergent properties that are incredibly altruistic and beneficial to other people, like sparking the computing revolution or creating a vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So any thoughts on that tricky balance?
The first thing is just this whole idea of altruism. And people get very upset about this idea that when I'm arguing that it's just really all about virtue-based status, because it sounds like I'm saying something very cynical, but I don't think I am saying something very cynical. Like when you do something good, generally people respect you more. They offer you status. That's your reward for doing the good thing. And also you feel good in yourself. You feel, oh, I feel great. I feel good. When I've come back off a shift for this, volunteering thing and it's gone well, I'm driving home, I feel great about myself. That's not a bad thing. That's, to me, is the best thing about human nature. I mean, what an amazing animal that we are, that when we do good, when we do something that benefits somebody else more than it benefits us, we're rewarded by other people automatically, and we feel good about ourselves. Like that's actually a really good thing. That's not a negative thing. You take that away, and I think we really would be back into the realm of nature red in tooth and claw. So this idea that we should feel guilty when we feel good about ourselves when we do something altruistic or selfless, I think is wrong. I think we deserve, that's the deal again that Storr makes. We deserve to feel good about ourselves, and we deserve the status that other people give us. It's a great system, and it's a wonderful system because it's automatic. Mostly, when people find out that we've done something good, they'll think better of us, and that feels good. So it's a wonderful system. And the other thing is about this idea of success games. I mean, this is another thing I think the way that my perception has shifted doing this work. And I could even narrow it down to a particular moment. I was in India. I tend to go away to Asia to do all my reading, so I lock myself away for weeks. And I was walking around thinking about all this stuff, and I saw these women just sitting on the street in Mumbai, chatting away happily. And what they were doing, you see this a lot in India, if you've been to India, is they've got this bag of these very pretty flowers, and they sit there and they're threading these flowers into a necklace, and then they'll sell the necklace. And so You just had, so, I mean, it's kind of obvious, really. But what are these women doing? Well, they're adding value. They're taking the flower and the thread, and they're turning those into something that's worth more than the flower and the thread individually. And that's capitalism at its best. Somebody comes along and sort of magically adds value. They create something that's worth more than its individual pieces and parts. And that is a wonderful thing. That is a fantastic thing. I mean, I wrote in my book about we've got a supermarket chain here, Tesco's. It's like our Walmart. And Tesco's annual tax bill is £4.5 billion. £4.5 billion. So that's how much value they're putting back into our country, into our police force, into our road system, into our school system, into our health service. You never really think about this stuff. But these capitalists who are, yes, they're interested in the share price, and they're interested in they're paid huge sums of money, and we're envious of their big houses. But they're also doing this incredible thing of creating enormous value for society and civilization. And, I was a journalist for the first 20 years of my life. I'm very happy that we're telling stories about corruption and tax dodging and all the malevolent things that capitalists and business people do. But I also think we should talk more about the 4.5 billion tax bill, because I think it would make us less cynical about people playing these success games. And I think that would be good for us.
No, it's tricky. I mean, I think I'm a capitalist. I know I'm a capitalist. And, you talked about the Industrial Revolution, which, was amazing in many ways, but also probably the point of origination for the climate crisis that could have deeply deleterious impacts on my child's future, et cetera, et cetera. And we also have extraordinary income inequality, and I think there are fair questions to be raised about how the allocation of wealth in our society. And so it's not an unalloyed good, capitalism.
No, absolutely not. And that's why you still need the virtue games. I mean, you need success. It's very crude generalization, but generally speaking, you can see the right as the success game people who are interested in business and capitalism and demolishing regulations and lowering the tax bill. And you've got the left who are interested in the virtue, protecting people. And that's exactly as it should be. The fact that we've got this kind of constant war between the people who want to supercharge capitalism and the people who want to say, well, hold on a minute. What about the climate crisis? What about the people at the bottom of the path through no fault of their own? So the fact that there's this constant toing and throwing between these two poles is exactly as it should be. Like, it's fantastic. Like, it's although it's bloody and difficult and enraging when you're living in the middle of it, if you take a step back, it's a great system. And as you rightly say, I mean, these are capitalism. I mean, they always think, when people talk about, is capitalism good? Is it bad? Is religion good? Is it bad? I mean, this is storytelling. It's not realistic. I mean, capitalism, religion, these are incredibly complex systems, and they have a incredibly complex set of trade-offs, and capitalism is no exception. Capitalism is incredible and amazing, but it's also horrendous and exploitative and miserable. That's the unhappy, not kind of non-story of capitalism. It's not good or bad. It's both at the same time. But what you have is the left telling one story, the right telling the other story. But in their tussle, in their kind of eternal war between virtue and success, we hopefully, end up making things better. Hopefully.
I want to go back to what you said before about and I agree with this about this. There are many bugs in the human design system. But one feature in the human design system is that when we do good, we feel good. That's just incredible. And I think, personally, my opinion is, if there is salvation on offer for the species, it's going to probably be in that direction. And you said something about the fact that we shouldn't feel bad about the fact that it feels good to have the approbation of other people when we do a good thing. But and I agree with that. And I think it just sometimes plain feels good to be useful to other people when nobody else is looking. So you can take status out of the benefits of altruism, and the benefits are still there.
The idea is that feeling that we get internally of how we're. The idea is that's sometimes called the internal audience. So we've evolved to be a tribal species. So what we want to be doing is pleasing the tribe, because by pleasing the tribe, we get connection, we get status, we're accepted, and we're valued, which is what we want. But you have to have a way of kind of policing yourself, imagining, I'm going to do this thing and how I'm going to feel. So we've almost got this internal tribe that we carry around with us, and it can be a terrible thing because I'm sure everybody has this thing where just out of nowhere, you remember something shameful you did like 25 years ago, and suddenly you go, "Oh God, it's this awful thing." But that's your internal tribe, giving you the shame of the tribe, saying, "Don't do that again." It's like a pain system and a kind of pleasure system, but a kind of internal social version of that, and it's just all part of being a tribal species. So that's why we can feel kind of this bump in status even if we're alone and nobody's seen us do what we do, is because you've got this internal audience that's constantly assessing our behavior to make us hopefully a better tribal cooperator.
One more question about altruism. And I definitely take your point that it is, I think the largest point you're trying to make here, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that, in the midst of a culture where we have plenty of unhealthy status games on offer, and we'll talk in a minute about social media, altruism is a great diversifying factor for your status games, and that can really help you get a sense of meaning and worth that is incredibly helpful no matter what else is going on in your life. I believe that is the or at least that's the major takeaway for me. And I do want to point out that I can see in my environment, not in myself, because I'm constitutionally wired really for selfishness, but I can see among people in my personal life and in my work life a kind of catastrophic altruism where people are not asserting their own needs enough, and so I just want to see if you agree with that flag.
Yeah, I of course we're all different and we all have different strengths and vulnerabilities, and that's certainly true, that you can fall into this kind of pathological trap of not asserting yourself enough, and in A Story Is a Deal, one of the things I write about is this need that we have for individual status, and I think it's the least understood kind of facet of all this stuff. And in the book I argue that in the 20th century the communists and the capitalists were actually making the same mistake about human nature, which is that the successful human should just blend into their group and become this part, a kind of an invisible part of their organization, whether it's being a communist, and communists weren't supposed to work for themselves, they were supposed to work for the revolution, for the communist ideal, the collective. But in a lot of these capitalist companies too, in the Ford Motor Company, in a lot of the, even the Wall Street banks in the 1990s, you had to be this kind of corporate clone. You had to be to dress precisely as the bank wanted you to dress. You couldn't have a beard, and so there was this sense that you had to become, again, this completely kind of invisible, kind of faceless, cell in the corporate superorganism, and it makes people feel terrible. People need to feel individually valued and individually seen within any group, and I think that organizations are still not great at understanding that.
Yeah. So if you're setting up a system where you're erasing the possibility for status, it's problematic.
Yeah.
Getting back to this discussion of like how to manage the fact we all have this status drive, this status detection system, and we talked about some ways to have healthier sources and to diversify and to explore altruism. What about mindfulness? My understanding, of mindfulness as a practitioner is that it's a kind of self-awareness that allows you to see the shit that's coming up in your head and not be so owned by it. So, for example, I might notice, I'm tempted to virtue signal on Instagram, or I am tempted to brag about something, or I'm tempted to dominate somebody to make myself feel better. And I can watch that urge, not tell myself I'm a monster, that urge is there, it's natural, let it go, and make a saner decision on the other side. Does that sound to you like a good way to manage this part of our wiring?
So there's a couple of things about mindfulness. So what you're describing, of course, is wonderful. This idea that you can detach yourself from your behavior and not be your behavior, and not allow the behavior to dictate the feelings to dictate your behavior. So that's obviously kind of helpful and a wonderful life skill. But the idea that mindfulness meditation kind of destroys the ego and frees you from the need to earn status is just not true. There was a study that was done by the University of the Netherlands that they took 3,700 mindfulness meditators, and they chose people specifically that meditated to reduce their ego needs. And they found that they all measured very highly in what they called spiritual superiority. So they all, and it's human nature, of course. They were really good at meditating, and they felt pretty good about that. And actually, when they thought about it, they felt superior to all the other people that didn't understand the amazing insights that they had. So I thought that was just really funny, So and of course, it's funny because it's one of those things that's funny because you just know it's true. Like, it's just human nature. When we get good at something, when we feel like we've got this special insight into the world, we feel great, we feel a bit superior, so that's what people find. But so again, not to say that there's no point meditating, because that's not true. I think the model that you described, where you kind of free yourself from being a slave to your emotions, is enormously valuable. But the idea that it destroys the ego, I mean, in one of my earlier books, I wrote, I went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat, a Vipassana meditation retreat in Australia, and I'll never forget on the second day, because we had to like sit cross-legged for 16 hours a day and meditate. It was an absolute nightmare. And then in between meditation sessions, the guru would come, this bald-headed Brit would come and lecture us about things. And on the second day, I was kind of pulled out of the thing, and I was given a note because nobody was speaking. You have to go and see the guru. I don't know what the right word is. And I went to see him, and he told me off because I was sitting with my legs. There's hundreds of people. He'd spot me at the back, sitting with my legs stretched forward, and the soles of my feet were facing him. And he took enormous offence to the fact that my soles of my feet, so to the extent that he would pull me out and and chide me. And I remember thinking afterwards, hang on a minute, you've been talking to us about the destruction of the ego, but this is just an extraordinary example of the fact that you've got a very, very brittle ego, that you've taken offence at this. So yeah, that I think that was the first time I ever got sort of a bit cynical about this idea that meditation really destroys the ego needs. I don't think that's necessarily true.
I mean, let me think about, what do I think about this? My understanding of the Dharma specifically is, and I can't speak for the mind of a Buddha, because I am very far from that. And so maybe at the deep end of the pool, a truly enlightened being, if there is such a thing, doesn't care so much about status. Although if you look at the Buddhist texts, the Buddha himself is talking about wise people and unenlightened worldlings. So there's status baked right into that. And he called himself the Tathagata, the awakened one. So there's status built right into that. But in terms of the rest of us, I think it's not so much about destroying the ego as it is about seeing through, is like kind of putting it through a cheese grater, seeing through the illusion of the insubstantiality of our stories, and not in the end being so owned by them. And in a lot of the art and storytelling around enlightenment, this process of getting to the end of the meditative path, the end is sometimes described as returning to the marketplace. So it's not like you float off into, I mean, there are some versions of this where you float off into the mystery, I don't know, but there are other versions where you become enlightened, you see through some of the more obnoxious aspects of the ego, and then you return to the marketplace, you return to the world to be more helpful.
That's great. Yeah.
So that's kind of my semi-informed take on what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I have the same response as you when you actually look at the kind of ideological, if that's the right word, structure of Buddhism. It's very hierarchical. It's not about reincarnation, and if you do well, you get reincarnated up here, and if you do badly, you don't. You're down there. That's a status game. That's just a pure status game. But yeah, I agree. Aside from that, I think to see what's happening when you're feeling humiliated, when you're feeling disrespected, and not respond to that, not react to that, I think is incredibly valuable. Incredibly valuable.
Easier said than done, but not a bad North Star. Before I let you go, let's just talk about social media, which is your fellow Brit, Johan Hari, has called social media, among other aspects of modern life, ego itching powder. That's a phrase I like. As social media, I mean, even I'm somebody who never really used it. But then in starting a new business, realized that it was kind of dumb for me not to be, in that particular marketplace. And I've tried to become what I call like a node of sanity. I don't scroll through Instagram much. I go to look at how my posts are performing, which makes me unhappy. And it is essentially a status game for the internal audience and for comparison to who knows what ideal. And then if I do find myself scrolling, that also makes me unhappy. And I'm a guy who's, like in the mental health business. And so what about, everybody else? This seems like, and I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying social media should be banned. I'm just saying this seems like a treacherous zone. So what say you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, before, well, in the early days of social media, you had the kind of utopians that thought that when the internet became universal or nearest damn it, that we'd see this new reality and all the hierarchies of the past would be destroyed and all this stuff. And it's sort of deeply naive because what happens when you connect 5 billion brains together? I think there's about half the population of the world are on social media now. Is that people start playing status games, and earlier on I described 3 main games: there's dominance, there's virtue, and there's success. Well, that's social media. You get people are pushing each other around in that kind of cancel culture kind of vein. You've got virtue signaling everywhere, which is obviously something we all do. That's part of playing a status game. And you've got success, people showing off about how thin they are and where they've gone on holiday and and look at my successful children, all the rest of it. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're playing status games, and I think the reason that social media has become so incredibly successful so rapidly across all cultures is because it's given us a new way of mining this incredibly valuable resource. I mean, there are lots of young people for whom they have more status packed into their phones that they keep in their back pocket or their purse or whatever than they do in their actual real lives. So you see why they get addicted to it. The self as they exist in the virtual space becomes incredibly important to them because it can be their main source of status. The other thing, of course, is the kind of BJ Fogg stuff, the idea that you could make phones addictive by making the rewards unpredictable. So, in the status game, I describe social media as a slot machine for status, because you never quite know what you're going to get. You put a post up, you just describe checking your post and how they're doing. Sometimes it could go amazing, sometimes it could be a disaster. So you never know what you're going to get. Yes. And that was the amazing insight of BJ Fogg when he wrote his book Predictive Technology in 2003. He predicted the invention of the iPhone. There's a paragraph in that book that describes an iPhone, years before it was even invented. It's an incredibly prescient book, and in there he says this is how you make it, essentially addictive. Is you make it like a slot machine. You make the rewards unpredictable. And of course, BJ Fogg's, course, the guys who invented Facebook and Instagram all went through his course at Stanford University, and we're now living through the kind of results of his genius. Sure, he's a genius. I mean, it's an incredible insight, but incredibly powerful. But even BJ Fogg, I think, didn't understand what exactly we were gambling with. He doesn't really talk about status, but to me, having done this book, it's clear that's what we're gambling with on social media. We're always gambling with our status. I mean, it's built into the platforms, likes, retweets. There are so many ways of measuring status on Twitter, X, Facebook, and all that stuff.
Do you have thoughts on how to manage our relationship with social media successfully, aside from just abstinence?
I'm a believer in the Carl Jung always talked about this idea of making the unconscious conscious, and how even that could be a powerful thing. And I guess it goes into what you were saying about mindfulness too. I think understanding what social media is and why it's addictive, that alone can be quite powerful, because it makes you see that the likes, they don't really matter. It's just that a status detection system is glomming onto the likes, the retweets. So, it is just a game. I mean, the other thing I think is very dangerous about social media is that the easiest form of status to get is virtue-based status. And especially on social media, all you've got to do to get some virtue-based status is to attack one of your ideological enemies in front of your peer group, and they're going to think you're great. And I think that's why social media becomes so toxic, because it's a very, very easy way to earn virtue-based status. It's you can just do it in a few clicks and you're there. So one of the things I write about in the status game is the idea of reducing your moral sphere. We're always these days, especially on social media, looking out into the world to morally judge other people, and actually to reduce that sphere and focus much more on your own moral behavior, and stop being so bloody obsessed with everybody else's moral behavior, because your obsession with other people's moral behavior, a lot of that is to do with the desire for status, and it isn't very nice as it manifests on social media. It's not productive.
But just picking up on that, we're at a time where there's in my country, in the United States, where there's an enormous amount of tumult and upset about perceived moral flaws on the other side of the red-blue divide here, whatever side you're on. I strongly suspect many of the people listening to this are on the blue side of it. Yeah. But I really want this to be a place for everybody. But so how when you say reducing your moral sphere, if that's the right phraseology, if I'm reproducing that correctly, are you saying that I shouldn't look at people from the opposite party and take a critical eye to their moral behavior?
I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I'm saying that you should try and see through the story. I'm a left-wing person. I'm from a Guardian journalist, but doing this work I wrote my former book Selfie when Trump first came in, and I had to sort of quickly add a whole chapter to that book before it went to press to sort of like trying to account and explain for the unexpected election of Donald Trump the first time around. And and what doing these kinds of things has taught me is that the story is very seductive, and actually it's often very destructive to both sides. And what I believe in my middle age is that the left and the right just see the world in a different way. They tell a different story of the world. It isn't that one side is evil and one side is on the side of the angels. It's just they both kind of see half of the truth. I talked about the idea about complex systems. The economy of any country is a complex system. The effect of immigration into the economy is a complex subject. It's it's incredibly complex. But we tell very simplistic stories, morally drenched stories about this stuff. And what if I could make one change in the world, it would be that the left and the right stop falling for their very emotional, very seductive, very simplistic stories about the opposite team, and just try and understand in an open-hearted way why they're telling a different story about the world, and why it doesn't come from a place of malice and hatred, because both sides equally see each other as coming from a place of malice and hatred. To get rid of that emotional stuff and try and understand why they believe the world should be that way. I mean, one of the things, it's a very simple thing, but maybe it's a good way of explaining it, is this idea that I always brought up with, which is you can tell the Tories, our Republicans, are evil because they always want to lower taxes for the rich. And so what could be more evil from that? You're making the rich richer, and because you're lowering taxes, you're making the poor poorer. I mean, you can't argue with that. But then when you listen to the story from the other side, it's like, well, yeah, because the rich are the ones that are creating the value. The rich are the ones that are, forming these companies that are paying all the taxes. And if you tax them above a certain level, they'll just leave the country. They'll bugger off and go somewhere else, or their companies will fail. So you don't want to do that. So there's this very delicate balance between raising enough tax revenue to look after people we need looking after, but also protecting the people who are creating the value that's enabling our National Health Service to exist and paying for the police. So these stories can seem inarguable, but there's always a story on the other side, which if you actually take the time, and being 20 years a journalist forced me to do this, to go to the opposite island and talk to people that I might not otherwise talk to. There's always a story from the other side that once you get rid of all that moral judgment and all that rage, you think, okay, I might not agree with you, but I get that now. I understand that now. So I think that, so of course, criticize when you feel you need to criticize, but I feel like both sides spend far too much time criticizing at the moment and not enough time understanding. This place that we're in, where each side thinks they're the devil, is horrendous, is awful, and it's all storytelling.
Well, I have a large degree of agreement with what you're saying, and perhaps it's not a coincidence that I too was a journalist for 30 years in TV, and so I lived my life, talking to everybody from cult leaders to terrorists to people I disagree with politically. That was my job, and so I really am able to kind of understand that everybody got their story, and very few people wake up in the morning deciding I want to be a bad guy. Having said that, I recently have spent some time on social media making the case for understanding, if not compassion. I actually think understanding is a form of compassion in the second era of Trump, or then the second chapter of Trump or whatever. And generally speaking, it's been well received. And there have been some people who are like, you're a financially secure, straight white male. And some of the threats that I perceive as keen and acute don't apply to you. When the president gets up and says there are only two genders, that's not a problem for you. Then when abortion is banned, that's not a problem for you. When I don't know, if they can't figure stuff out in Ukraine, you're not a Ukrainian. On and on. And I think you could probably make the same case from the right vis-a-vis the perceived threats from the left. And so I just am curious. I mean, I think I have an answer to this, but I'm curious what your answer is, because you could probably get the same accusations hurled at you.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, everybody's got their own set of reasons why that they can feel that they're under attack. And I think a lot of the reason why Trump won the first time is because the left in the 1960s stopped caring about the working class and stopped caring about the white working class in particular, and started caring much more about issues of gender and race. So I mean, it happens. We're the same in the UK, that the white working class stopped being cared about by the left, and they started actually sort of being the enemy and started being looked down upon, and we didn't call them deplorables. We always call them racists and football hooligans and this, that, and the other. Every side has its own set of ideas as to why they feel that it was sort of victimized by the culture, but and of course there's always going to be points in history where you do have to fight. Like it talked all about the Second World War and the end of slavery. Sometimes you've got to fight, and that's just a fact. But I still feel that if you really want to make the world a better place, it is about understanding. I talked earlier on about that. The story we're never told in the UK about the things that we have done in the past that have been against racism and bigotry. That people on the left that I know it would make them sick to tell that story, to actually say, come on, Britain, we've been anti-racist in the past. We should be proud of how anti-racist we've been, because it goes against everything they stand for, which is the British horrendous colonial, this, that, and the other. If you actually want to persuade people, if you want to get people on side, you have to tell them a story that's not going to alienate them and push them away and make them feel less than. In other words, you have to tell them a story that's not going to take their status away. And then that can be really, really hard, because it can go against our principles in a very deep way. But that's the best way of doing it, because the more you fight one way and you might win, but then the pushback from the other way is going to be even bigger. And you see this at the moment between the left and the right. The left wins, then the right wins bigger, the left get more fiercer, and it's just this escalation of aggression, an escalation of storytelling, which I and I don't think it ends in a good place.
And the word you didn't use there, but you do use it in the book, and it is kind of the atomic bomb of emotions. I believe Brene Brown even said that, is humiliation.
Yes, that wasn't my quote. That was somebody else. I forget the academic that came out with it. But humiliation being the atomic bomb of the emotions. If you humiliate somebody, you take away all their status in a very sudden and sort of public way. It's at the root of the very worst of human behavior. I talk in the status game of, I kind of tell the story of the Second World War leading up to the Holocaust from the perspective of status. It makes sense suddenly when you see it through the lens of status. Germany was the most successful high status country in continental Europe. They were humiliated after Versailles. The Jews got the blame for that. And look what happened. This has been a fascinating discussion. I suspect people have feelings about it. So I have a pretty active chat on my Substack, and so I'll open up a chat and let people feedback on this. Maybe I'll even ask you if you can come into it. Of course. Okay, so if you're listening to this in real time, you can come chat with me and with Will about it. Two questions I ask kind of habitually at the end of every show. The first is there something you were hoping we would get to that we didn't get to? No, I think we covered a huge amount in a relatively short space of time. So thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. Likewise. Thank you. And then finally, you mentioned the names of your books, several of them, but can you just give us a full list? And also, is there a website? Just everything Will Storr, so that if we want to dive in, we can. Yeah, the website is willstorr.com. It's the STORR. Just very briefly, the books, The Heretics is about, is from my journalism days, going out meeting Nazis, cult leaders, finding out why people believe that why intelligent people believe, sometimes crazy things. Selfie is this history of the Western self. And then there's the science of storytelling, the status game we've been talking about tonight, and A Story is a Deal is my new book out February the 12th. So it should be out by the time this airs. And that's how people use storytelling for kind of persuasive and sort of leadership goals.
Excellent. What a body of work. Excellent. All right. Well, Will, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate the good chat. Thank you.